Today, I'm going to show you another troubleshooting tip, especially when you're working with Azure services such as Azure SQL DB. With that, you'll need a little bit of KQL or Kql query language. That's why we're here today. My name is Julie Koesmarno. I am a program manager in the SQL Tools and Experiences team. Let's first get started with Kql query language. Kql query language, or KQL, is an optimized query language that supports interesting visualization options. So it's worth really trying out. And it's fast read only data, or it's optimized for fast read only data retrieval. It's great for troubleshooting and deep analytics. And if you're working with big data analytics or a lot of kind of logs data, it's really great for that. So specifically today, I'm going to dive into the Azure Log Analytics or Azure Monitor Logs data that captures or that stores the SQL events. All right, so what do I mean by this? So from Azure SQL DB, you can emit the event data or event log and store it into Azure Monitor Logs or Azure Log Analytics. And depending on your diagnostic settings, which I'll talk to you about later, the event data will be stored in Azure Diagnostics table or Azure Metrics inside Azure Log Analytics. And to set that up, this is how you do it from the portal. But of course, you can do this through the like PowerShell or ACCLI. So first of all, you go to your Azure SQL database, and then you go to diagnostic settings, and then you choose whichever setup you want. So as an example, you can decide to log automatic tuning or errors or timeouts or blogs or deadlocks. We're actually going to dig into the deadlocks today, and some metrics as well. So metric is usually a bit more summarized than log. So log is a bit more verbose. And if you choose the log options, then it will actually go to the Azure Diagnostic table if you decide to send the log data into the Log Analytics Workspace. And if you choose the metric option, then it will go to the Azure metric table. Pretty straightforward, actually. So let's dig into it more. So once you set it up, you're probably wondering, how do I access this log data or this event data? There are a couple of options. So the first one here is using the Azure portal again. So if you go to your Azure SQL DB database or Azure SQL database, there is an option of going to the logs, and then you'll see a screen like this, which offers you a couple of pre-canned queries that help you to get started, especially if you're new to KQL. This is a great way of starting. But one of my favorite ways is using notebooks. Now, some of you probably have heard me talk about Azure Data Studio Notebooks quite a bit. And this is one of the reasons why I love doing this, because it makes it easier for me to demo certain things. And especially in this kind of short 20-minute session, I think it's really worthwhile. And most of all, it's very easy for me to share the notebook with all of you. And you can share it with other people. So it's also a good learning tool. That's one of the reasons why I love notebooks. All right, let's get started with KQL. All right, with that, let me jump to Azure Data Studio. So here, I do already have Azure Data Studio launched. I'm actually using the Insiders one. Very brave, isn't it? All right, here, I'm actually using Python kernel. Now, some of you already know that notebooks actually are made up of code cells and text cells. So over here, it's just text cells, and then I do have some code cells that I already pre-run before. If I scroll all the way up to the top, I actually had to reload the Kql Keywords extension first. Once I got that set up, so Kql Keywords is a Python package that you can install using pip, by the way, or you can also use this managed packages UI in Azure Data Studio. So I'm going to close that. Let's get back to the notebook itself and the KQL itself. So once I loaded the Kql Keywords, I can provide the connection, which is the workspace ID, and you can get to the workspace ID of the log analytics from portal. So it will be some kind of GUID. So make sure that you know how to get there. And if you actually are familiar with ACCLI, you can use the try ACCLI login. That way it remembers all your login. It's pretty easy to use. All right. The next step is to really dive into the KQL part. So let me just minimize the notebook viewer from the screen. That way it's not too distracting. All right, so in KQL, it's one of the most elegant languages that I've ever learned, actually. It took me a while to realize how elegant it is. So if you start with a table, so for example, Azure Diagnostics, if you just type in Azure Diagnostics in the kind of Kql query language editor, it will just show you the entire data set. So it's like your equivalent to select star from that table or select star from Azure Diagnostics as an example. So what I have here is Azure Diagnostics and then pipe summarize count by operation name. What is that equivalent to? It's actually equivalent to select count star. So let me just scroll a little bit down here. So the above query earlier is the same as select count star from Azure Diagnostic group by operation name, but it's structured in this way. So pretty straightforward. So we use summarize in KQL instead of group by, and then you define the function, the aggregation function, and then what you want to group by. And you'll notice that I am using percentage KQL here just because I'm using Kqlmagic inside notebooks. If you are trying to run this query, this KQL query in Azure Portal, you don't need the percentage KQL because it is a native Kusto editor. So for notebooks inside Azure Data Studio, if you're using Kqlmagic, you'll need to put percentage KQL. So this is pre-run. What does it mean? Over here, it's actually analyzing all the data in the Azure Diagnostic table and do an event count by operation name. So if we take a look, so this is getting into the troubleshooting or the monitoring side of it. I'm looking at the list of operation names here. Depending on how I set up my diagnostic settings, I get a lot of different operation names. In this particular instance, I actually happen to be enabling, I think, five of the events. Audit event, deadlock event, error events, query store runtime statistics, timeouts, and this shows the count. So let me scroll a little bit more. So over here, now remember I mentioned earlier, this is a tip for troubleshooting Azure services. So it means that your other Azure services outside of your Azure SQL DB can also go into Azure Diagnostics. So that's actually the advantage of having Azure Monitor Log or Azure Log Analytics, is because if you have to correlate of what's happening from one Azure service to your other Azure service, you can use Azure Diagnostics pretty easily. But for this specific instance, I'm only just analyzing one Azure SQL instance, and I'm looking at the data from the time generated or the event from 5 days ago. See how very easy it is for me to specify it was 5 days ago or from 5 days ago, right? And then do the group by or the aggregation. So let's categorize or let's group by the category and then do a count. And then let's do a simple bar chart. So there in KQL, there is a render syntax here or function here for you or to allow you to simply render a bar chart, which is very, very useful. And if you're coming from Python background, you probably know a little bit of Plotly. And in Kqlmagic, the chart is actually sent to Plotly. So that's why the chart here looks very familiar. As an example, if I want to dig into the deadlock side of it, I can use my mouse to zoom in, and it will zoom in. I can zoom in even more. Right, so it's pretty awesome. Again, that's one of the reasons why I like using KQL and Kqlmagic for troubleshooting. So let me just go home here and just reset. All right. Okay, so here's another one. If you want to do performance troubleshooting, this specific one here is actually the code that I got from the Azure portal itself. Remember when I said, hey, there is a, if you're pretty new to Azure Monitor Logs or Azure Log Analytics, and if you're new to KQL, try this pre-canned queries. So one of them was, I copied it across and then I pasted it here. And specifically this one, it's asking for, getting the details from Azure Metrics from 60 minutes ago related to deadlock. It didn't exist because I didn't create any deadlocks at the time, so there is nothing returned. So over here, it's pretty straightforward. It just returns no result set. And if I want to, I can simply clear it because it's probably not useful to share with others, so I can clear it up. But I can dig into other table or other queries. So for example, with this one here is Azure Metrics. Now, you're probably wondering, in SQL statements, I could do select and then some columns, and then from the table. Now, to do that, you actually use project. Yes, the keyword for select columns is actually project. But if you want to remove, so essentially I could do this. So if you know there are some columns that you don't want to show, for example, in demos like this, because they are sensitive columns that might have subscription ID or resource ID or tenant ID, and you don't want to show that, you can use this keyword called project away. How cool is that? And yes, and take 10 is just saying top 10 in select statement. So just from here, I could quickly see if I want to just, double check on my metrics and just show the top 10, this is what I can see and, analyze and, so that I can troubleshoot what's going on. All right, so let's dig into the next one here. All right, this is where it gets really serious in terms of troubleshooting side of it. Now, when I'm looking at what's going on with my service sometimes, I want to know what are the most problematic events that happen. And I can do that through the Azure Diagnostics, and I can summarize, say maybe, bin it to every 2 days. And you can also change this to, say, for example, every 10 minutes like this. But for now, let's just do 2 days. And then I'm doing the essentially group by the operation name. And I just want to dig into the non-audit event. And then I want to render a time chart of it. So it looks like I have a lot of errors, right? There's a lot of errors even from yesterday. Okay, so that got me thinking, what are the errors? So maybe it's to do with deadlock. So let's analyze some deadlock events. So over here, I've got Azure Diagnostics. So I'm going to the, the log itself, and I look at the deadlock event. So from there, I could list all the deadlock events. So for this example, I'm actually just using take 50, but it looks like based on the above chart, let me just hit home. It looks like I don't have too many. So the green one is the deadlock one. That's why it's returning only 5. And then I could also find the deadlock query plan. So yes, there's also parse XML function, which is super handy so that I can find the query plan hash or the query hash. And I could even go to the query store runtime statistics event, which is very, very handy if you want to find out, maybe queries that are not performing too well. So let's get back to that error. So it's not just deadlock that was problematic, but it's also other errors. So let me just show you the specific statement. So over here, I'm just filtering to the error event, and then I am analyzing it by the error numbers. So some of you are probably very familiar with some of the SQL error numbers. If not, that's okay. You can always search it online on your favorite search engine in terms of what the error numbers mean. There's also sys.error messages if you want to look it up on the DMV, but I digressed. So it looks like I have a lot of 208 error here. So 208 is the most one. Yeah, so I need to get better at my 208 error. It turns out the 208 error really means that object is not found. So doing a lot of select something from a table that doesn't exist as an example. So that's pretty bad. And then my next popular event that happens to be 1222. That's because I was simulating deadlock event. That's why I have the timeout event expired. That's the 1222. Yeah. And lastly, if you ever want to know who is the culprit that actually deleted your tables, this is one way of doing it. So you can go to the Azure Diagnostics table again, look for the action name batch completed. Now this batch completed is actually emitted from the security audit event, and you can search for a statement that looks like drop table. So here's an example of ones that I found out, the tables that have been dropped. And I believe in the Azure Diagnostics table, there is also a way of finding out who the user is that dropped this. I just didn't happen to show it on the query here. And that's it. So those are some really simple queries that get you to get started on troubleshooting what's happening in your Azure SQL or Azure services. So if you do have something like Azure Data Factory, same steps actually you can follow in terms of turning on the diagnostic settings. Let me go back here. So in the relevant Azure Data Factory sort of service, there should be diagnostic settings that you can follow the steps with turning on the log and the metrics. Obviously, the log and metric would be specific to the Azure service that you choose to emit events. Okay. All right. Let's do a bit of a recap. And hopefully, you'll be able to access this from the chat. Hopefully it's pasted on there. There is the slide deck is posted, so that way you can look through the queries and compare KQL and SQL. So here's a comparison of Azure Diagnostics query, where you're searching for deadlock event and you're doing a select time generated category resource operation name type deadlock SMLS. So essentially these columns, and then do a sort by time generated in descending order and just do a top 50. So in KQL, you start with what is the data set that I want to look at, and then slowly filtering it down and then showing the parts that you need next. The order of the filters or the statements, or maybe not the statements, but the lines do matter, because if you say, for example, swap take 50 first and then the where operation name, it's going to behave differently. So the order does matter. So it's, to me, since I come from kind of like a set mindset in mathematics, to me this KQL is actually very easy to grasp. And then the next one I showed you earlier, very straightforward, essentially using Azure Diagnostics table again, filtering to batch completed, and then look at the statements that have drop table. And this is the equivalent in SQL, which is like top 10 star. Show the columns from Azure Diagnostics, and then do a operation name like drop table. So in KQL, the string operation, for example, contains, it matches with like in SQL. So in KQL, there are a few other string operations or functions that I think you might find really useful too. So these are other KQL keywords that are worth looking into. For example, ago, summarize, parse XML, bin and render. So those are those keywords that I'm displaying on the screen here are the ones that I have used earlier in my demo. All right, if you're interested in learning more, please go to this link, and let me also double check on the questions. Oh, by the way, I used Azure Data Studio earlier. It's an open source client tool, cross-platform, so you can run it on macOS and Windows and Linux as well. So give that a go too, and get that from aka.ms get Azure Data Studio. All right. There's a question, just to clarify, this notebook are run within Azure Data Studio? Yes. It was run in Azure Data Studio, just happened to have pre-run it. But if you decide to not use Azure Data Studio Notebooks and you want to use something else, it is possible as well. But I have tested it more in Azure Data Studio, obviously, since I'm from that team. Let's see. Oh, there are more questions, and we've got a couple minutes, which is great. When would you use KQL in notebooks versus Azure Servers versus batch service? Does KQL work the same in all those tools? So let me try to distinguish the differences. In KQL was actually originally created for Azure Data Explorer. So the widest or the most supported language or syntax in KQL is actually from Azure Data Explorer, but you can run quite a lot of the equivalent to select statement, the query retrieval, the data retrieval syntax there. But in terms of the tooling perspectives, I actually haven't used it in other tools besides Jupyter Notebook, as well as the Azure Data Studio. So, all right, let's see. By the way, I'm seeing quite a lot of questions, and there is a Teams chat, so I'm going to follow up there since we're out of time. All right. With that, thank you everybody for joining the session. Hopefully you can join the next session with Drew, I believe, on SQL development. So check that out.